Hi beautiful souls, welcome back to the channel. This is going to be a different kind of video today because, well, I was making coffee this morning and I had this sudden realization that maybe I should make a video on the channel talking about trauma. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this video, is how to identify indicators of trauma in your natal chart. And trauma is something that everybody has experienced when they were younger, because trauma means a stressful situation that influences your psychology, influencing you mentally, emotionally, spiritually, or physically, those stressful experiences. And so that's simply trauma. Trauma in the natal chart can be seen by looking at how the outer planets in astrology are making aspects or influencing the inner planets in astrology. And outer planets, we're talking about Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in this case, and the very reactive, sensitive inner planets that can easily be influenced by these outer planets that can cause the trauma is specifically the Sun, the Moon, and Mars. Those are the main ones. And so what this is actually telling us is that trauma is the result of the outer planets, which is represented by a collective issue, collective psychology, imprinting that influences individual or personal imprinting, Sun, Moon, Mars, specifically these three that we're talking about, at a time when the person who is experiencing the trauma is not yet ready to experience such a worldly collective suffering because they were very young. So when we have trauma, it's because we were too young, too naive, and we're still in the process of developing our personal self, but we had to be exposed to the society or the collective adult, shall we say, pains and suffering and issues. That's what causes the shock and the stress, because of this it's kind of like being jerked into reality before you have an awareness or a true understanding of what reality would bring to you. Because when we come into the womb and we're born in this earth, we're actually coming from a place of timelessness. We're being jerked into time and space dimension. So we have to, it takes us years to really get used to what's going on in this dimension. And if we're jerked into it with regards to the outer planets in astrology too quickly, then it causes this disruption in our development. Specifically if the outer planets are making hard aspects to those three inner planets that we talked about previously. So now I want to go into indicators of trauma in your natal chart, and then at the end of the video, how do we heal ourselves from this trauma? Because if we are not healing ourselves from the trauma, what tends to happen, and this leads to my coffee experience this morning, is that we react to circumstances and situations in the present day that we perceive to be a repetition of our trauma, whether it is or not, meaning that there can be circumstances that are not actually a repetition of the trauma, but we're so used to coping in a particular way to protect ourselves from the shock that we experienced when we were younger, that we're still coping in that way, and it can lead to complicated relationships, blockages in life, because we haven't let go of those defenses, those insecurities. So, when I was pouring my coffee this morning, right, I was drinking coffee from a filter bag, and what I tend to do with this particular package of filtered coffee bags is that I would rip the top of it, because to kind of open the filter, I have to rip the top, and I would rip it, and I usually rip it too far. So instead of it just ripping the top part of the filtering bag, it would rip halfway down. And so This has happened several times, and when I pour the hot water into the filtering bag, I would have to pour only halfway into the filtering bag, because if I poured it the whole way, it would overflow. So I'm just used to like pouring the water and then kind of removing my hand when the water reaches halfway. But this morning, I finally didn't rip so far. So I ripped just enough, meaning that I'm actually able to pour the hot water to fill up the whole filtering bag. But as I was pouring water to fill up that filtering bag, I took my hand out when the water only reached halfway into the filtering bag, because I'm used to doing it. It's my reflex. It's the way that my muscles have worked, because I needed to prevent against the overflowing of the water in the filtering bag. Even though today I've managed to rip correctly into the filtering bag and I didn't need to pull my hand out that fast, but I was still doing it because it's a reflex. So that's kind of like what happens with trauma, is that we have reflexes in our muscles, even in our cell memory sometimes, to situations that may not be a repeat of our past trauma. And so that's why it can really affect different areas of our lives and cause lots of blockages if we're not healing from the trauma. So the first indicator that there can possibly be heavy trauma in your chart is that if you have Pluto conjunct any of your angles, the ascendant, the IC, the descendant, or the midheaven. And sometimes it's Pluto being in the 12th house and conjuncting the ascendant from the 12th house. That can also indicate really deep trauma back in childhood, because it's in the 12th house itself. So Pluto doing any of these things is going to show that the exposure was very heavy. There was exposure to taboo things that even adults would consider taboo, like sex or dark magic and the occult, some kind of manipulation or control or abuse of all forms. You were exposed to this before you should be. The second indicator of trauma is when we put the inner planets into the mix with Pluto in a hard aspect. So specifically the moon being in a conjunction, square, opposition, or in conjunction and semi-sextile to Pluto. This is an actual trauma that is imprinted in your cell memory, and sometimes it's ancestral, meaning that it's something that it's kind of like they dumped it into your life. Sometimes it's the mother, but it can also be before the mother with regards to ancestors as well, that it's creeping into your development. It's kind of like a family baggage that's sometimes not even yours, imprinted in you before you were even born sometimes. Sun Pluto also is showing a male authority figure who was threatening or scary. So Sun opposite Pluto, Sun square Pluto, Sun in conjunct or semi-sextile to Pluto. And so there's a certain amount of power struggles that you may continue in your adult life to experience if you haven't embraced the power within you in the correct way. There may be periods of losing self-control and then controlling yourself very strongly and then losing self-control. So this is about that balance of self-control, but not having power struggles while gaining your self-control. Mars, Pluto, square, not the conjunction with this one. The conjunction is a little different, but the Mars, Pluto, and Sun, Pluto is also the conjunction. But Mars, Pluto, it's not really the conjunction, but generally the square, the opposition, the in conjunction, and the semi-sextile, that's really heavy as well. This is showing that there's a lot of struggles with exerting your actual willpower in a way that makes you feel powerful. And sometimes this draws people into your life who step over your sexual boundaries and your self-assertiveness, but it's not stepping over in a Neptunian way. It's stepping over in a way where you're struggling with each other. There can be violence that occurs as well. And with Mars, Pluto, it's also showing guilt that is being instilled when you wanted to take certain actions. And so this can lead to sexual guilt, meaning that you struggle with having an equal sexual relationship with specific partners that you may encounter in your life, because in your childhood, certain pleasures and desires were made for you to feel that it was guilty, or that it was shameful, that it was taboo. So those are the first kind of harsh indicators. Now, Neptune also shows trauma, but different from Pluto in that Neptune is showing trauma that has to do with something's missing, a perspective that is being imprinted upon you that is of martyrdom, meaning self-sacrifice, to feel better, or self-sacrifice to escape, or self-sacrifice for whatever the reason is that you don't actually have to sacrifice. So the heavy one is the Sun being in a hard aspect to Neptune, like the conjunction, the square, the opposition, the inconjunction, and the semi-sextile. These are really heavy because the identity is being infused with martyrdom, and the boundaries of how much you're going to save other people is not clear. And it can be really hard to get a grasp of how much saving you have to exert or do. And this can lead to people stepping over your boundaries, but also you enabling in other people a certain amount of addictive behaviors within them that's just not healthy. Moon, Neptune, specifically the conjunction, that's hard. The opposition and the square, not so much the inconjunction, but the square and the opposition, specifically with Moon and Neptune, in a sense that it puts your intuition out of balance with this. The Moon is the most intuitive part of all of us, and Neptune is illusion. So Neptune blurs intuition, leading to various ways of escaping from reality, escaping from using your intuition, meaning that you give that away to other people, or you resort to using your mind, and then we get into situations where people take advantage of us because we're not clear about whether certain people are good or have bad motives. Moon with Neptune in your childhood is going to show abandonment of some sort from a mothering figure, whether that is a real abandonment or it's an emotional one, or it's perceived by you as being so, but it was an incomplete nurturing as well. Saturn represents a kind of trauma that is about authority and responsibility. So it's this forceful need, an imprint when you're very young, this forceful imprinting of taking on responsibilities at the expense of your own, self-expression or your own wants or desires, in a way where there was a dominant person who, it's like they forced you into this, and you had no choice. And so the Sun square Saturn, Sun opposite Saturn, Sun conjunct Saturn, Sun inconjunct Saturn. That's just kind of this blend of energy where your self-expression has to be compromised at the expense of responsibilities, and you can struggle with authority figures and people dominating in your life with this one. There's Mars and Saturn. This is really, really a toughie. Mars square Saturn, opposite Saturn, conjunct Saturn, and the inconjunct and the semi-sextile between Mars and Saturn, because Mars and Saturn, this is Aries, Mars, this is Capricorn, Saturn. They naturally square each other on the zodiac wheel. They're both very authoritative, independent types of figures. When you put them together, it's showing that your desires, your spontaneity of Mars, your need to do something. When it was younger, it was punished, it was forcefully held back. This is a physical body type of a trauma. So So yeah, with Mars, it tends to be a physical trauma, meaning that you were either physically punished or physically forced with all Mars and outer planet aspects. The Sun, it's going to be your self-expression, your identity, finding out who you are. That was challenged. The Moon, that's going to be your intuition. You know, intuition is, it's just as important as the brain, the intellect, and the logic. So that was off with any of these other aspects for one reason or another. Also, Moon Uranus, that's also a pretty hard one. Moon square Uranus or Moon opposite Uranus. The conjunction is okay. Those specifically with square and the opposition, because that's showing an unstable nurturing while you were growing up. Somebody was there, then they were not there. You don't know what to expect. And that's going to lead to reflexes in your adult life of detaching, attaching, detaching, needing speed, needing adrenaline, attaching. So it can be this kind of a vibe. Now the other one that doesn't actually involve the outer planets is the Sun being in a square to the Moon, or Sun in conjunct to the Moon. That can also show a certain amount of trauma, but this is more about your inner self and the way that you are influenced by your parents' relationships, because the Sun represents the father figure, the Moon the mother figure. The Sun square Moon or in conjunct to the Moon, these are heavy ones because there can be tensions, separations, a lot of fightings in the home, and so it may cause you to not really be aware or not be sure about how to make yourself feel better about yourself on your own. And so your wants and your needs are going to be out of balance because that was not given in a proper way when you were growing up. So now to add on top of this, if you've got what we've discussed previously, but at the same time any of these planets fall into the 12th house or the 8th house, that's going to exacerbate this a little bit more, because the 12th and the 8th house are sensitive houses. If, for example, let's say you have a Moon square Pluto, and let's say the Moon is falling to the 12th house and Pluto is falling into the 4th house, it conjuncts the IC, that Moon square Pluto that we've got there. This is a really kind of, these are unconscious houses, and they're going to be so hard to untangle. The consciousness to be aware of why things are, you're experiencing blockages in your life, and how to, move into the higher vibration of and heal yourself. That is really hard to come to the surface because it's falling, the planets are falling to unconscious houses, and trauma is already unconscious. The Moon and Pluto are the two most unconscious planets. And another thing, the last thing I want to mention here is that if you've got any of the indicators that we've mentioned previously, but at the same time these planets or points that are involved in these particular aspects, they are at what in astrology we would call an anorectic degrees, meaning that they are at 29 degrees in the natal chart and above. This is the last degrees of a particular zodiac, and planets or points lose energy when they're at the last degrees. They're kind of, they don't have enough energy to fight for equality or to have the stability, the power to express themselves fully. So there can be overcompensation, meaning there's too much of it going on or there's not enough of it going on. So strange things can happen when planets or points fall in the 29 anorectic degrees. So what do we do when we have trauma? Well, first is to be aware that this is happening in your life. There's blockages in your life that are repeating itself, whether it's in relationships, in careers, in finding your life purpose. They're repeating. They keep happening as a pattern over time, and you can't untangle yourself from it. And sometimes a really good indicator that you have unresolved trauma is when you draw relationships into your life that are either abusive or toxic or not satisfactory. And it's a pattern that keeps happening. Or you hang on to one for a really long time. This is showing that there's something going on there that remains unsolved. And so, of course, first of all, is to be aware that it's happening. Astrology can really help a lot to pinpoint what the trauma might be. But at the end of the day, to heal from the trauma, it is recommended to go through a purging phase. And purging means that you actually relive the trauma in your adult life through some sort of technique that you can develop, like meditation or talking it out, or simply just feeling it. Again, kind of reliving it in your mind, seeing those images, tracing it back, bringing up the memories. And this is not recommended if you are, if you have no one to help you through this. It's not recommended to do this alone because it can be a scary place. But if you have a psychologist, a therapist, or maybe an astrologer, a tarot reader, or somebody that you really trust, it could be a friend or family member, if you feel like they're not going to be overwhelmed by it, then you can consult them from time to time or work through it with them. But a therapist or psychologist is probably the best because they're going to be able to have insight into this. But you want to choose a good one. This is important. One that you really trust. Be selective in the professional that you're choosing to help you through this. So the purging phase may look something like living the memory again in your mind and crying, or sometimes it's a scream therapy where you scream it out, you let it all out, and it's basically pushing through the pain. And sometimes, in astrology, if you're going through like a Pluto transit, for example, this is when this kind of thing comes up and you are faced with the confrontation of having to purge. But at the end of it, once you relive your wound, if you're brave enough and courageous enough to face your own wound, these traumas, they're a part of you. And it's just the bravery that is required to push through it. Of course, with a logical head, meaning that you have a professional to guide you on the way, of course. But it's a part of you, and if you're afraid to look into it and to purge through it, then you're afraid of yourself. And that's really not a good place to be, to know that there's something inside of you and to feel like it's uneasy, it's outrunning your life, but again, I'm not gonna go there. Then you're denying a part of yourself. And if you could heal those wounds, you will be awakened and feel whole. You've taken your darkness and you've, investigated it. You've given it light. That is a wholeness. That's the inner stability, the inner peace, the inner balance that can never be taken away from you, that can never be disturbed. When you push through the deepest wound, the deepest pain inside of you, you just get to peace. There's nothing below the pain except peace and quiet, an awakening and balance. And you become transformed. You become a new person. You no longer have to react unconsciously to situations in your current life. Unconsciously, meaning it's a reflex. You no longer have that reflex anymore. You no longer have to pour hot water into the filtering bag and then removing your hand unnecessarily early simply because you were used to doing it that way. Yeah, guys, that's just something that I wanted to share with you today. And if you have any of the indicators I mentioned today, and if you've done a certain amount of purging or healing from the trauma, do comment below and let us know what your experience has been. And I do feel that once you really manage to heal from the trauma, you know, the compassion and the self-love that you've given yourself there, you can give that compassion and self-love to the person who has caused you traumas as well. Because at the end of the day, nobody wants to really hurt another person. The person who is hurting another person is not awakened. They're going through trauma in their own life. They have unhealed trauma, and therefore they are hurting another person. But if you forgive them for it, you are forgiving yourself. If you haven't forgiven that person, you're still operating on agitation. There's still agitation, irritation, uneasiness inside of you. And why would you keep that feeling inside? That is not giving yourself self-love. If you forgive the other person, just let it go. You are healing yourself. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button if you haven't. And if you're already subscribed, thank you very much for coming along. I do birth chart readings, synastry, and relationship readings. All the information is on my website. You can check that out. And that's it. Have a beautiful day, beautiful souls. Bye.